Welcome, Rabbi Tom Cohen. Rabbi Tom Cohen was born and raised near Portland, Oregon in the USA. During his studies at Portland State University, he became more and more interested in religious philosophy and the question, what does it mean to be Jewish? He continued his undergraduate studies in Los Angeles, California. He's from Kehillat Gesher, and he is married to a rabbi, Pauline Babe. And I know Rabbi Tom from Owensing Ruby Union Institute. And I just told him it's not in his biography. And I think that's a mistake. And the other thing, and I am so admiring, is that he started his own Jewish summer camp for people in Europe. In Switzerland?
No, it's in France.
It's in France.
Yes.
So, which sounds like a lot of fun. And there's one other thing I have to say about Rabbi Cohen. He taught me how to buy cheese, and he told, this is what he's, and I don't know, maybe I've studied other Jewish things with you, but the cheese has a story.
Gavina is very important.
Yes. And I look for the unpasteurized, that has a good flavor. What farm is it from? And my cheese selections just are 100% better because of our friendship. But with no further ado, Rabbi Cohen, we can't wait to hear a little bit about the Jews of France. And I have to remove
Thank you very much. And I when Vanessa talked to me, I jumped at this because I admire her so much. Matter of fact, I do need to, after this, to have you contact the person who's going to be in charge of our camp this year, because we want to talk about ideas for the educational aspect. And you are the person who we turn to for this information. She is wonderful, and the fact that your community lets her go every year and so forth is very important, because she makes an impact not only on the kids of all of the communities around the Chicago area, she made an impact on a community in France. I just that's just start off with that. Tom Cohen.
Thank you. And it's all in the cloud, and I'd love to work with that person.
Okay, that's great. What can I can say? She was right. I grew up in a little place called Oak Grove, Oregon. Only Jew in my area. That's and eventually I got involved in the question, what does it mean to be Jewish, besides the fact that I have 8 days of presents at the end of the year with Hanukkah. That made me different than my other friends who only had 1 day of presents. Eventually, I started rabbinical school. I went through the conservative movement, so I'm a ordained conservative rabbi. But at that time period, when I started my studies in Los Angeles, all roads led to New York. And if you're from Oak Grove, Oregon, New York is crime city. It's Gotham City. Who the hell wants to go there? So I decided I would stay in Jerusalem as long as possible until the director of the school would come to Jerusalem, find me, drag me kicking and screaming back to New York so I could finish my studies. While I was there in Israel, I met a French girl. And like most of us, or at least me, I had an education, geographically speaking. I had to look up where France was on the map. I had no idea, but the girl intrigued me. I did go back to New York, ended up loving it. I'm glad they got me there. And then immediately after I was ordained in 1991, I moved to France. I spoke with the vocabulary of French bread, French dry cleaning, French, that was my French at that point. I had to learn it in the streets. And when I came to France, to find the girl, she had come back a year earlier. She was ordained from the Leo Beck College of London, is where she did her studies. And she's somebody who's linguistically, she had already a degree in English, so she corrected my English all the time. She had a degree in Hebrew. She spoke German as well, and all those sorts of things. She's one of these type of people that I can be very jealous of, but she's my wife, so I can be proud of her as well. When she came back a year early, because their program's only 5 years, where ours was 5 or 6 years, She said it's because we're slow learners. But anyway, she already had a congregation where she was the second rabbi. But when I came to France, I discovered a whole different type of world. We have terms, we talk about reform, conservative, reconstructionist, renewal, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Haredi, and so forth. France didn't have these terms. And it didn't quite fit into our world viewpoints quite neatly as I would have liked. You have basically, in France, when I arrived, you had what's called consistoire and liberal. And then you have Chabad. Everyone has Chabad, somebody out there, they're even on Mars when they go, they welcome the perseverance. But the consistoire was an official Judaism up until 1905 in France. It was created by Napoleon. When Jews were first given citizenship, France is the first country in the world that enfranchised its citizens. In America, we all became citizens together. France is the first country where we weren't citizens and then we were enfranchised. But when Napoleon took power, he put back into question, do Jews get to keep their citizenship or not? He had what was known in history, a famous moment called Napoleon's Sanhedrin, where he called together 120 of the famous rich intellectuals and rabbis of France, and he gave them 10 questions. And based upon how they would answer it, Jews would get to keep their citizenship or not. Some of those questions are the same ones we have to deal with today. Like, do you accept a Jew marrying a non-Jew? Their answer was very, as they say in French, rusé. They got around the answer by saying, we recognize civil marriage. They didn't say anything about religious marriage. So, okay. And other questions dealt with dual loyalty questions. If you go to war against the Prussians, will they, and there's Jews on the other side, will you fight against them, or are your brothers the French, and so forth? All of the questions that we have to deal with today, and in different ways, we've chopped up that cake. He, though, at the end of that time period, he probably had a headache that you couldn't imagine, because the joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Imagine 120 rabbis and major leaders, balabasim of the Jewish community. He walked out of that with, a migraine like this, and he said, never again will I deal with all those Jews. He decided to create an institution, an official Judaism, whose part of its role was to assimilate Jews into French society, requiring that they give their sermons in French instead of in Yiddish, for example. Amongst the little things of that sort, but amongst the things he decided to do is there's going to be a chief rabbi of the country, then a chief rabbi of the province, then a chief rabbi of the city, and that way he'd only have to talk to one Jew, give them one order, and it would go all the way down to the Jew in the pew. Every country that he conquered throughout Europe, he installed this system. That's why throughout all of Europe, you have the ideas of chief rabbis. The British at the time period, who are the enemies of the French, thought this is a wonderful idea. They based the United Synagogue of England on the Consistoire of France. And so indirectly also, when the British get the mandate over the land that will become the state of Israel, they install their system, the United Synagogue with a chief rabbi that's based upon the chief rabbi of France on Israel. Israel, the only thing they did when they created said, it's not Jewish to have one pope, Jewish pope. We're going to have a chief Ashkenazi rabbi, chief Sephardi rabbi. So indirectly, that whole institution comes from France. America and South America, they don't have any of this, obviously, because we weren't under the controls of Napoleon. But what it meant is that there was a coherence within the Jewish community, and you could not be anything but consistoire. It was the only option. There was nothing until 1905, when you had separation of state and church, which makes French secularism very different than American secularism. Being a secular in America, the whole idea of our myth in America is the pilgrims, a persecuted religious group, come to America. So the role of the state is to protect the persecuted group. Whereas in France, religion was the problem. We had to get the monkey off our back. So the role of religion, of the state, is to protect the individual from religion and not protect for religion. And that's the from and for is the very difference between our two ways of dealing with secularism between our two countries, but it's historical. Why it has an impact here is the consistoire, this Orthodox type body, was actually not very Orthodox. And at one point, they in the 1870s, they had the chief rabbi had sent a letter to the New Brunswick Conference, which Vanessa will talk about some other point about reforming rabbis. He sent a letter saying, I'm going to come and adhere the consistoire of France to the reforming rabbis conference. Unfortunately, war breaks out between the French and the Prussians. There's a war. France loses Alsace and Lorraine to the Germans. And from that point on in French history, anything German is verboten. You can't get involved. And that stays the same until we get back Alsace and Lorraine at the end of World War I in 1918. So in that entire period of 40, 50 years, anything German was bad in French society, including for the Jews. So in 1905, when you could separate and have for the first time a non-Orthodox synagogue, a liberal synagogue is what they call it, they couldn't make reference to anything that's going on that will create the future modern Orthodox, conservative, and reform movements, which is the laboratory that's going on in Germany. So they had to create in their own minds, what does it mean to be non-Orthodox? Some of the things that are fascinating for me when I came here, the oldest and largest non-Orthodox synagogue of Paris and France, when I first arrived, it's on a street called Rue Copernic. It's 1,800 families, and for 70 years was the only non-Orthodox community in the country. It did not count women in the minyan. A girl could read from the Haftorah, but not from the Torah. It had a mikveh. In the prayer book, they still called for the sacrifices, but they were patrilineal since 1905, which is not going to, that is to say, you're assumed to be Jewish if you have a father who's Jewish and not just a mother who's Jewish, 75 years before the American Reform movement even thinks about it. Just to give the mixed up. I also discovered other little things. Coming from the conservative movement, we learned as the gospel that the very first bat mitzvah was the daughter of Kaplan, Mordechai Kaplan, in 1925 in New York City, and his daughter does that first bat mitzvah. I came here and discovered that the consistoire, the Orthodox body, were doing bat mitzvahs in Alsace and Lorraine already in the 1880s. It wasn't quite exactly what we do today, but neither was the daughter of Kaplan's was not quite what we do today. But already having a ceremony just for girls was 40 years before that. As well as I'm just a lot of little things that I discovered along the way. I discovered that when I came, I'm a flaming egalitarianist. I have no problems whatsoever putting on the table and so forth. And I came with this conservative ordination. I thought, I'm nice, right wing, and all those sorts of things. I discovered I was the radical when I came to France because I had in my prayer book. I had the imahot, the matriarchs, as well as the patriarchs when we read the Amida and so forth. And that put me at odds out with the liberal community in France. When I first came here, there was, in 1992, basically, the winter is when I first arrived, there were 6 non-Orthodox communities in Francophonie. Francophonie would be for all the French-speaking regions, so Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Switzerland, and France. Those 6 communities with 2 communities in Paris. The 2 communities on top of it both had long-time serving rabbis who didn't speak with each other in the entire time. When I came, actually, I was in the office of the rabbi of the oldest community, who's trying to explain to me how things work in France. He was very anxious one day, and I said, "Why are you so upset?" He goes, "I'm going to be on a radio program with somebody who I haven't talked to since 1977. and that was the other rabbi of the other synagogue. So, that's a Jewish story, I guess, of France.
Yes, it is. Not
Yes.
surprised.
Not surprised. The synagogues here, though, by necessity, I guess in France culture to begin with, things evolve very slowly. But they're also, how can I best say it? It's not in increments, but it's in leaps when things change. All of a sudden, things will change with a radical break, and then everyone will pretend that's always been that way as well. Give examples is everybody hated the pyramid. I don't know if you know of this in the Louvre, the largest museum of France. They have a there's a glass pyramid that's used as the entranceway. Famous architect Pi had created it. It was everyone hated it, and if you look at all the newspapers, they said this is a catastrophe. Now everyone says, "Oh, it's always been like this. It's wonderful." It's the same with the Eiffel Tower. When you go back, everyone hated the Eiffel Tower. There you go, the Louvre pyramid. The Eiffel Tower, everyone hated it. Now it's the symbol of France and Paris. So on a general culture, that's true. How much more so in the Jewish community, where we often reflect the land where we live in. When I first also came here, the 2/3 of the Jewish community came from North Africa. Former colony or former protectorate, or Algeria was France itself. The Jews, I got to see a little bit of what life must have been like for our ancestors in New York in the 1900s. Because when you came in, when you read books from the 1900s, everyone went to their Landschaftsman synagogues. If you came from Hoi Ploi in Poland, you all went to that same Hoi Ploi synagogue because you seen the melodies as you should, because that's how Moses did it on Mount Sinai. And those other guys, the Litvaks over there, they got it all wrong, right? Within 20, 30 years, nobody remembers if it was a German or a Russian synagogue. It's now become just Ashkenazi, right? Over time, you lost it. When I first came here, there was synagogues where not only just because they're from Tunisia, the people went from Tunisia, but one came from Tlemcen, which is on the border of Algeria and Morocco, and the other one was from Tunis itself, because we put the Psalm 30 before you seen the Psalm 150, whatever it was. The order was different, and there might be some slight musical differences. And so the result is you can't pray in that synagogue. You have to go to the other one, which was fascinating to see that. We're already now, I'm an old man now. I get to see some generations who are growing up who are no longer so connected with the town, but they're now becoming more countrywide. So we tend to go to the Tunisian minyan as opposed to the Jews of Tunis minyan, or the Jews of Le Golut, or the Jews of Tlemcen. So you lost the village aspect, the Landschaftsman part, and we're at the stage where it's now the Algerian, Moroccan, or Tunisian shuls. The Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, 1/3, mainly from the Alsace region. And matter of fact, the Jews who came in Paris, the Alsatian Jew, the first Jews to really come to Paris was right after the Germans took over Alsace in 1870, because that's where all the Jews lived, is in Alsace-Lorraine for the most part. There's some other two other areas, but those are the majority of the Jews. And when it was taken over, the Jews chose to remain French, which meant they had to leave. So many came to Paris for the very first time. So the oldest synagogues, even in the Orthodox world that you'll find in Paris, tend to be from only 1870s, not that old. You have to go to other parts of the country to find much older synagogues. The Jews in the Alsatian, or these Alsatian Jews, like my wife, whose family goes back at least the 15th century, if not more, that they've traced in Alsace. These Ashkenazi Jews do not have the same Ashkenazi makeup that we have from Eastern Europe. how you've seen the Torah is different. The idea of we consider Jewish foods, they don't consider it at all Jewish foods. They don't have the Jewish deli for us, with the hot pastramis and the pickle flesh, and they don't have that type of idea of that's Jewish food. That's American Jewish food for them. That's interesting. But for example, Hanukkah, in my wife's family and in many other Alsatian families, you eat shukrut, sauerkraut, which has lots of different meats in it, and you have duck oils and so forth, because it has oil in it, I guess. But which I never thought about as a meal to have on Hanukkah. But now, when you put out a good shukrut for me, that's like, oh, it's Hanukkah time. Okay, it's been long enough. So you have different touchstones. So if you think about the American who comes here, the majority culture of France is Catholic. The majority culture in the United States is Protestant. It's a world of difference. Even if the French are the least likely to go to a church out of all of Europe, by all of the standards, the Pew surveys and so forth, it is a profoundly Catholic country. And in a Catholic country, the law is the law except when it isn't the law. Think about in the Middle Ages, as a Catholic, you could buy back your sins, which becomes the problem which will create Protestantism. They didn't like that idea that, you could buy back your sins and so forth. And so Protestantism tends to see things black and white. This is the law, it is like that. And if you don't like it, you create a new branch of Protestantism. So that is why it breaks up so very quickly. Whereas, here it's very, I give it one example. In the States, and this comes from the very first time I took kids to Osri, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. I went to the director of the camp of Osri the very first year I went that we came there, and I told him I have to take the kids to see Chicago. The director of the camp was not thrilled with this extra expense that I was bringing up, because, it's just in his planning. I understand, being a director now of a camp, you have your planning, and all of a sudden I come in and he said, okay, first he said no. And then I said to the director, think about it. If you took a plane for 9 hours with a bunch of kids, you flew into Charles de Gaulle Airport outside of Paris. You got on a bus and you went 2 hours north out of Paris, and you spent an entire month in this little camp, or wherever. It was a big camp, but a little camp. And then you got back onto you go back to the airport, get on a plane, and you go home, and you never saw Paris, right? And I said, they've never seen an American city, Osri is Oconomowoc is a wonderful little town, but it's not, it's not the same thing. So, we took them to Chicago, and I remember in French society, for like transportation, we all have cultural norms that we don't even realize. And that's something I learned along the way by being here, which is, for example, the consumer here is the one who has to open up things like doors on a train, until they got electric, and now they open, you don't have to do anything. So a train stops, your job is you push the button, you open the handle to get out or get on the train. In American trains, you have somebody on each car who gets off, and he opens the door for you. Okay. I get the kids onto the train to take them down, because the director says, I can't drive you down to Chicago, but I can take you to the Milwaukee Airport train station. You'll take a train, you'll take it into Chicago, and then you'll spend your day and see the kids there. So we get on the train. It was very fun to watch the kids as at one point, they turn to me and say, when does the train go? That moment where it kicks in and everybody's head goes backwards, because that's what they've grown up with the speed trains. It didn't happen. I mentioned the train has actually been going for a little while. They didn't even realize it. Okay, so that's fine. We get to Chicago, but it's when we came back that became a problem. They give you this warning, 2 minutes in Milwaukee Airport, 2 minutes, and get ready. So I tell all the kids after a long day, get up. I'm yelling at them in French. We got to get off the train. They're all standing up, and nobody's moving as the train came in. I'm worried, because if we miss the bus that they sent to pick us up. Then we're going to go into Milwaukee itself, and I don't know how the hell we're going to get back to the camp. And then finally, like a dam breaks, we get off. When we get off the train, all of a sudden a man from Amtrak comes over to me. He's one of these type of guys who has no neck. He's huge. I'm not Vanessa will say I'm not the tallest person. I think I'm normal height. Everyone else is abnormally tall. But anyway, this guy is screaming at me, saying, "Who the hell do you are? What do you think you're doing?" And I knew that I can't really talk back to this guy, because first off, he's an agent of the train station. I've gone from Chicago, Illinois into Wisconsin. If I say something, I could actually be not only a state crime, but it could be a federal crime, because if you do something from one state to the next, you could have different charges, so forth. I know this, they don't know this, and they wanted to protect the rabbi. They were going to go around the guy, but basically the problem was they opened up the door to get off, and he didn't open up the door, and because it took him a while to figure out all these locks and security things to open it up, because the consumer is supposed to open it up for them, and for an American, he's supposed to close it. I do all of that to say, in French society, you have the right to yell back at a policeman, which you would not have in the States. In France, the policeman is actually supposed to salute you, and as you come up to them and ask them a question. And anytime when I see somebody getting a parking ticket here, you can be sure that you're going to learn a lot of French that you would never learn in the Alliance Française if you listen to the conversation, to the person, to the agent who's giving you the ticket. And that's normal here. Whereas in the States, I would be on the ground worried that I could get shot. At least we see it. That's how we see it from here. And that comes from being a Catholic culture and a Protestant culture. Now, on top of that, though, the Jewish culture that you assume is not Ashkenazi. It is Sephardi. And so the American who comes over to France is a minority within a minority. Just to give a background. It's in that context, I met 5 couples, basically 5 New York Jewish women, who, by dint of the fact that they're New York women, and they're Jewish, that's all they know about their Judaism, because everybody's Jewish in New York, right? They married French guys. Half of them were Sephardi guys who threw the tefillin over the sides of the boat as they came to France, and they were going to become more French than the French. A couple others were fallen Catholics who had never, since their baptism, haven't set foot inside a church in their lives. And they basically were starting to have kids. And they wanted to create something with me. Basically want to know, could I teach their kids why they should be Jewish? So I took the challenge. I decided to try and teach them why they should be Jewish, hoping it might trickle down to their kids. And that became the beginnings of my community, Kilat Gesher. So it was 5 families in 1993. Today it's 200 families within France. We just moved during this time of COVID, because I had a small place, a Stibolach, for those who know Yiddish. It was about 120 square meters. Let me try and, that's what, 1,200 square feet, basically. Small. I mean, I imagine it's probably smaller than the entrance of your synagogue, to put it in that context. And that was everything. The prayer room was only 32 square meters, so it's really small. But we'd get like 50 or 60 people crammed into it, literally. I was glad that no police ever showed up to see if it was safe, because we were always way beyond the safety bounds. But because of COVID, we realized we could no longer use it. We finally got a new place. Behind me, it's my first time in my life I have an office. I don't have. I'll show you maybe the other synagogue and the other rooms and so forth. But it's about 450 square meters, so 4 times the size, and a room for prayer that can have about 150 people seated. So this is a huge change for us, but we had to do this, raise the money. community, and we have to build things during COVID, which has not been an easy experience. France, what can I say quickly is going on for the community? Today, there's about 18 synagogues that are non-Orthodox throughout Francophonie, France, Sweden, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. There's been a big change that's growing. We're in a time period where the Orthodoxy here has become more radicalized. The consistoire, which was very open, as I told you, they were doing bar and bat mitzvahs in 1880s. They were going to adhere themselves to the reforming rabbis of New Brunswick. Today, they wanted to close down the rabbinical school and only have yeshiva buchers from Israel come to be the rabbis in their synagogues. They have very few people right now studying in that rabbinical school, and as a result, the Lubavitch movement, Chabad, has had its greatest growth anywhere in the world has been in France. About 15% of the active Jewish community is Lubavitch. France has about, it depends on which sociologues that you have, but it's hard also to have an understanding because you're not allowed to ask in France since World War II people's religion. It's against the law. For obvious reasons, but it was probably between actually, even with all the immigrations and so forth, about 500,000 Jews are in France. About 3/4 of that Jewish community is in the greater Paris area. And where my synagogue is located in the northwestern quadrant of Paris, the 17th arrondissement, next to Neuilly and Levallois. This is the greatest concentration of Jews in Paris is in this area. We call this the ghetto amongst ourselves. And France has the largest Jewish community throughout Europe. So my synagogue is in ground zero for Europe of Judaism. That's just to show how much things have changed. Questions that Vanessa had talked to me about was like, you probably want to hear a little bit about anti-Semitism in France. Which I'm always smiling and thinking about because yes, there's anti-Semitism in France, but I always think about how little people realize there's anti-Semitism in America. But it's not to compare, but I'm just pointing out one thing. One aspect that's very interesting to know in France. Anti-Semitism is a crime in France. It is not necessarily a crime in the States. It depends on which states. It depends on how but the result of having a specific law means that anything that is related to anti-Semitism must be tabulated. So if you write on a wall, "Death to the Jews" as graffiti, that will be in the count in France, where it might not be in the count in America, because it could be just considered, degradation of a public building or something it could be under a different file, so to speak, so it doesn't get all the way up. I say that as a background. France was 15 years ago was a very hard time. 20 years ago even, right after the Second Intifada, because one of the things that France has the largest Jewish community of Europe, but also has the largest Muslim population of Europe. Most of the populations came together to France in the same period, in the 60s. And in France, all of our problems are in the suburbs. They are not in the city centers. When you came in, you exported all your problems to the nearby suburbs, you get them away from the cities. And then Jews, like in many countries everywhere, within a generation, most of the Jews got out. And they became, entertainers or political leaders, and we spend our time saying, so-and-so, that person, even though his name sounds very French. In fact, he's a Jew from this little town over here, or that little town in Europe, or in Morocco, or something of that sort. And they tended to come into areas such as the 16th, the 17th, Western Paris. Not everybody got out. And it's those areas where you have a large concentration of Muslims. And when the Muslims first came here, this was the first generation of immigrants. France has had many countries. This is one of the countries that welcomes the most immigrants out of all of Europe. That you had a failed integration with the Muslim population, part of it because of technology. Because it's at the same time that you could get a radio satellite dish, they started to come in the 70s, 80s. You could start turning that satellite dish towards Algeria, and you didn't have to watch the same programs as everybody else. Whereas everybody else, since there was only 4 channels on French TV up until Pauline was in high school, everybody had the same touchstones of French culture. That no longer became true. And that had an effect. The other thing that had an effect was most of the Muslim families that came here, like any immigrants' families anywhere, they wanted to do better for their kids. That's why you go away. Why you rip yourself out of your fabric of friends and family is because you feel I'm going to build a better life for my kids. I'm going to sacrifice myself, but that generation will have a better life. Our grandparents did the same things for us, thank God. Okay, so what happens though? They ask themselves, is they're working like a dog, 16 hours a day, whatever, to try and make a life for their kids. They said, well, where did I get my values that got me here today? I got it from the mosque. So they want to send their kids to the mosque to get a good education, so they can get the same values that I had when I was in Marrakesh as a kid. But now flip it over when you come over here now to France. As you come over here, there's lots of groups. They're all extremely poor. Let's get down to it. As in many places, the immigrants are not getting top jobs. They're doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do. Same in America, same here. You don't have that much money, and you can't afford to rent nice places or even a big enough place for your community. And if you're a president of a mosque, you have under French law the same obligations of budgeting, having a balanced budget and all sorts of things that all organizations, at least in French society, are required to do. And you can't afford an imam because rabbis, imams, we all cost a little bit of money. It's a worthwhile investment. That's right, Vanessa? Anyway, so yes, but anyway, they can't afford it. So, but you had 2 countries for a number of years that were offering a free imam if you wanted it. Now you're an imam, you're the president of your association. What do? You got a free imam? You take it. If you had a free rabbi, you take it. You'd say, okay, we saved a whole bundle of money. But what the result is, you had guys coming from Saudi Arabia or Algeria. Those were the 2 places, and it's the radical versions of the religion that were being sent over for free, who didn't even speak French, who knew nothing of French culture, who become the teachers now of these kids. And so nightly on TV since the 20 years ago, when you see a kid who has become a terrorist and the parents are going, but we're not like that. I don't understand. He was never like that. It's true. That's why they weren't like that. But the message that their kids got was a very different message than what they got. And so that is something that they're not trying to change, but 10% of the community is radicalized amongst the Muslim community. That 10%, it's a large enough population that their population of radicalized Muslims equals about the population of the Jewish community here. I'm giving that as a background. So there is that as a challenge. French Jews, as though, on the other hand, have integrated to all levels of society. Even the recent president, former president, who just got charged with some legal problems, Sarkozy, during his election, when you go back to that, from the Jewish community standpoint, you put yourself back into that time period, you had on the socialist side 2 candidates out of the 3 who were Jewish. The third one was the one who got the position, and it's not because the other two were Jewish. It's because the third one was a woman, and that was just at the time that Hillary Clinton got her first mandate, and everyone in the world wanted to then pick a woman as their candidate. The woman candidate here, though, unfortunately, was not intellectually on the same level as a Hillary Clinton. Whatever your thoughts of her, she has an intellectual background that you can't deny, which you certainly could with this woman's candidate, but it was more imitation. But that was the socialist side, which is for us like the Democrats. The Republican side, which would be like Sarkozy, he was not Jewish, but it's where I'm at in the 17th arrondissement. His father, a Hungarian, abandoned his mother when she was after his birth, and she went back home. And her father was a pediatrician in this neighborhood, a Jewish doctor who raised him. It was his Jewish grandfather who raised him. And in his stump speech, when he was going around, he talked about that was the man who gave him all of his values. From the Jewish community viewpoint, at that time period, we can't lose. Either the right or left, we're going to have a Jew, as they say, entre guillemets and quotes, in the French version of the White House. So we've gotten to very high levels everywhere. And it's not just the Ashkenazi, it's the Sephardim as well who've come over here within that time period. But we had the terrible incidents. Part of it's because Europe is the playground for terrorists. It's easy to go from the Middle East or North Africa to Europe. And so we've had some 15 years ago, there was 974 anti-Semitic acts in France. But in 2017, just it dropped down to 300. I'm not trying to downplay it, because one of the victims of the Jewish Museum of Brussels, who was killed, of the 4 victims, was a member of my community. They had two Israelis who were on vacation. They had somebody work in the museum, and then there was a French woman who was a volunteer. That French woman was a dear friend of my community, because I have a lunch and learn group. She was part of it for 8 years, 9 years, and she had just moved two months before that to Brussels, because she was at a certain age, and she said, it's not easy going out in the streets at night at my age. And she remembered Brussels from her youth. That was a nicer, smaller city, and she decided to move up there. And I remember talking to Dominique and saying, but Dominique, at your age, it's not as easy making friends as before. She goes, no, well, I'll do exactly what I did when I first came to Paris. I'll volunteer everywhere, and I'll make friends. And she happened to be the volunteer that day that was assassinated. So I'm not downplaying the anti-Semitism, but I think that in your minds, it is far more important than it is in our daily lives here.
I think one of the reason I asked you is that you said you see on television, and when we see news of France, it's about terrorists and Jewish this, and
if it bleeds, it leads, right?
It leads. Exactly.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, for those of us who know Israel well, it is not as bad as it's portrayed in the news, and people are living their life very well in Israel, and they don't have a feeling like they're running from the brown shirts. That's basically, if you really get down to it, most of the French Jewish life. I will say, though, if you're in the suburbs, if you were a part of that population, mainly North African Jewry, who moved to France at the same time as the Muslim community from North Africa in the 60s, and you're in these, they're the north and the northeastern suburbs. We call that particular area the county 9-3 after its code, 9-3. It's a no-go zone. It's a no-go zone, not only because of the Muslim radicalism you might have, but it's a no-go zone because that's the drug world, which if you have no jobs, where do you get your monies? And there's a mixture between using the Islam as a political tool for the drug, to hide the fact that in fact this is all about selling lots of drugs And the police, it's sort of like, it reminds me when I was a student in Los Angeles back in the 80s, we were told, do not get off in the East LA. Do not, when you drive along, don't take that exit because you're going to end up in an area where you get killed. Or when I was a student later on in the 80s, in the late 80s in New York City, and JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, is at 122nd and Broadway. And there's a metro stop at 116 and one at 125th. 116 is Columbia. We were told get off at 116 and walk up. Never get off at Harlem at 125th and walk down. You'll take your life in hand. For us, that same phenomena, 9-3 is where you don't get off, if you can keep driving through. And the Jews who live in that area, they're getting it. They're taking it on the head. There's attacks against them, or there's more menaces. Like, for example, this last year, there was 600, or in 2019, a year and a half ago, there were 680 or so anti-Semitic incidents. About 150 of them could have been thefts or violence of some sort. No deaths, but some sort of violence. But the majority of 500, more than 500, are menaces, threats. The ambiance is, as I would say, is not so great. And so what has happened is in France, we've had an immigration. But the main immigration has been to leave those areas to nicer areas. So Jews all of a sudden are starting to move. They moved out of 9-3 into the 17th or into Le Valois, that's why this area has become the Jewish area of France. Jews have been moving to Israel, but not in the numbers you think. Even though you go there to visit, as I was pointing out to Vanessa at the very beginning, every 6 weeks there's 2 weeks vacation in France. And it's not just for kids. That's the thing that I didn't understand at first. First job, as soon as you sign a contract and you have a job and you're employed in France, you have 5 weeks paid vacation. Okay, just right off the bat, and it could go up from there. Okay, so everybody, you become French when, as soon as you're starting a vacation, our very first vacation in the school year. The school year starts the beginning of September, so it's the very end, last week of October, beginning week of November is our very first vacation. It's called the Vacances de la Toussaint. Toussaint is the All Saints Day, and Halloween, Hallows Eve, is the day before that All Saints Day. Okay, so it's based on Catholic tradition. Okay, but that's our first vacation. I go every year, except for this last year, to Israel. 4 hours flight. It cost me 250, 300 euros round trip. Jews, we have gone to, the Jews of France go to Israel all the time. So also our identity as Jews is much more tied up with how Israel is looked at in the news than it might be for American Jews. Because you're 12 hours away. How many of you have gone more than a couple of times and and that's and you're a dedicated group and so forth? That's not a complaint. It's a fact. Here, everyone goes at least once a year or so, because you can. It's easy. It's sunshine, even if you're not religious and you don't care anything about that. Like right now, it's ugly outside. It's gray weather, and you go to Tel Aviv. You can swim in the beach, and so forth. It's just that it's like going to Florida, I guess. I don't know. So part of the result is you have people who are going to Israel because just for visiting. Part of it, as I started to say earlier, for those who got on, it's the French tradition that you should have a home in Paris, and then outside of Paris you should have a country home. That's what you've grown up to be the standard, of Parisian life. That's when you really hit it. But they never bought the house because when the Moroccan Jews, I'll give that as an example, when the Moroccan Jews left Morocco, the rich went to Los Angeles and to Montreal. The intellectuals came to Paris, and everybody else went to Bat Yam, to somewhere in Israel later on. So the result is, it's not just you're going to Israel, you're going to see your brother or your sister, who, when the family left Morocco, one went to Israel, one went here. And so you're actually seeing direct family and not just a distant cousin. And you're going all the time. And so now if you came to France in the late 60s, you're now a grown man or a grown woman. You've reached the earning potential of your life. This is the moment when you're supposed to buy that country house. Why the hell would I buy something outside, 2 hours outside of Paris? I would never go there. I go all the vacation times to Tel Aviv. I'm sick and tired of sleeping on my brother's couch. I want my own apartment. They buy an apartment. On top of it, the prices to us look so cheap. It's we look at the price, for a Tel Aviv person, they look at it and say that's crazy, and we'll look at it and say that would be a closet. It's not closet. That's a mansion for us. We can buy the place. That's why French also have a very bad reputation amongst young Israeli couples, because they came. Because it's to us it seems so cheap, we didn't negotiate. In Israeli culture, you see the price, but it's the shuk. You're supposed to negotiate everything. They never negotiated. They wrote, you said, okay, it's 100,000 shekels. They wrote out the check. And the guy looked at it and said, he wrote out the check like that? I'm going to try 150,000 next time. And it just kept going up like that. And so young Israeli couples can't afford Tel Aviv anymore, partially because of the Americans, but partially because of the French. And the result is most of those quarters where they bought, because also you have to realize French law, if you rent out an apartment in France and somebody doesn't pay, it takes you months, even years to get that renter out of your place. The protection laws for a renter who in France is extreme compared to America. Israel is closer to America than it is to France in those protections laws. But the result is we always assume how things work in our country is how it works everywhere. So the French, when they buy a place in France, in Israel, they would never think about renting out the apartment, because God forbid, if they don't pay, I can't get into my apartment for years, and it's going to take lawsuits and all sorts of stuff before I can see it again. So basically, they close up those apartments and they don't use them except for those vacation times that they show up. And so you have whole apartment buildings of French Jews. Nobody's there. The whole building is empty. But when you get to that vacation of Tucson or the next one in December, all of a sudden it's filled with all the French and so forth.
I agree with you. I think there's animosity because there's all these places that are empty and you can't,
It's like the Americans have this in Jerusalem, especially the area of that used to be the no man's land between the old city and Western Jerusalem has been bought up mainly by Americans, and it's mainly empty most of the year. And the Jerusalemites detest it. Okay, but the other, so that's one aspect. There was, when we had the biggest attacks, when you had for the first time a school in Toulouse 15 years ago. When that happened, you did have a trauma in the community. You had a lot of immigration going to Israel at that point. Today, it's gone back to the usual levels and so forth. When they went, what people have forgotten is maybe already 40 to 50% of all those who've immigrated to Israel have already returned to France. Israel is not going to give you that as a statistics because it's not in their interest to talk about it. But what has happened, the people where the immigrations have worked is retirees, because they're not looking to get involved in Israeli society, or the young who have not yet created a life for themselves. They have no roots and so forth, and they can do the army and then they can get involved. Everybody else, that's a group that you have a lot of problems, especially if you're an eye doctor in Paris. The Israeli Eye Doctor Association is not going to give you a flower to get you involved because that's more competition. They're going to make it tough for you to get your job. So you're going to come over here. It's the old joke in Israel is, how do you have a small fortune in Israel? You come with a large fortune. They come, they have a lot, they have what's compared to the Israelis, a large fortune. They're there. They can't get the jobs that they used to have. They can't have the style of living that they had in Paris. And at the end of a 5-year period or so, the tax reductions that they had as a new immigrant is over. They no longer can afford to live in Israel, and so they all come back at that point. So there's a delay of about 5 years when the tax laws change, and then they come back home to France.
I have one political question for
Sure.
you. The Le Pens have tried to appeal to right-wing Jews. How's that going for them?
They're slowly getting more and more, but the percentage is not that great. It's sort of like the Republican Jews. Jews who are Republicans. There's been it's been a work that's been going on for a while, and there has been an increase. But in overall numbers, it's still small. But if you look at percentage wise, it's increased significantly from where it was. It's the same for the story for Le Pen type Jews. She's involved in in the party itself. Some Jews to be able to say, look, some of my best friends are, um, and some people will say because her main goal is not the Jews, it's the Muslims, that maybe that she'll be the source to protect us from any of the anti-Semitism that's coming from the radical Muslim community. Um, and she actually, it's not because of that she'll have it's not her who's gonna, it's her niece who has a very good chance of getting elected in one of the next elections. Not so much for the Muslim issue, but because the rest of the government parties have basically have lost all of their meaning over these past years because of their corruptness or their ineptitude. And so you're getting to that point where they said, well, we've tried everybody else, let's try this one. And she, and so that's right now her appeal. It's sort of I won't go further with that. You can make your own analogies. Yes.
Who yavin yavin.
Right, exactly. I love it.
Who understands, you understand.
Okay. Let me say, well, go ahead, Beth.
No, you finish, and then I.
Oh, I was just gonna say. So some of the other things I just want to point out, when my wife, who she came back to France after her ordination from London, she was in there was only 2 non-Orthodox synagogues. She was the second rabbi in the other synagogue, not the one that I was at, that that I told you was the oldest. Even in that synagogue, they thought they were egalitarian. But as many of our communities, even in the Reform world, when they first had to deal with women's issues on an intellectual level, they were egalitarian. But when you actually had to deal with it, they weren't quite as egalitarian as they thought. And she had to go through a lot of problems as the first woman on the continent, to the point where they eventually, about 200 families quit and created a community around her. Her synagogue created. From the very beginning, people said, why don't you guys work together? With my group that was slowly becoming a synagogue, and with its 200 families. And the thing that stopped me was when I first came to France, I went to a service that she was doing on a Thursday morning. In France, it's very important before the bar or bat mitzvah, on Thursday morning, you have what they call the tefillin ceremony. You do a service Thursday morning. You put on the tefillin for the first time for the kid. You wrap the lanier, the straps around the arm of the child, where it goes 7 times. Well, the tradition is you call up 7 different people who do a turn around the strap around the kid's arm, whisper in the kid's ear some sort of sweet blessing and so forth. You do a regular Thursday morning service. He wears his tefillin, or she wears her tefillin first time, and then you go on and do the rest on Friday, Saturday. I went to one of these because I had never seen it. That's not something we have in the States. I want to see that. And I was in the back of the shul. People didn't know that Pauline, my wife, and I were an item yet. We were trying to be under the radar screen. And the father was in the back where I was at, talking to his brother. He didn't really, realize who I was, and I was listening to him. And as he was watching my wife doing this ceremony with the kid, he said to his brother, "It's okay. We also have a real rabbi in this synagogue." Okay. So when she became a rabbi of her synagogue, I said, I can't be the excuse within her synagogue. I want anyone who joins her synagogue to owe up to the fact that my rabbi is a woman. We do lots of things together, but that it was important that we have that. We at one point, Pauline, when she was 18 years old, had been at Ozrui, this camp Vanessa had talked about, for one summer. she understood nothing that was going on. Her English was just beginning at that point, but she had the greatest of times. And she said that was a dream of her, that we should bring back kids to see this. That director of that camp graciously thought this was a great idea. So for about 5 years or so, we brought kids, for 20 kids, to America. The amount of money an American camp is a huge investment from a French family's resources. This was a huge endeavor, but the parents justified it because their English was going to be great when they came back, or even if it was terrible in the States, by French standards, they were going to get A's for the next 2 years of their schools. Okay, so we took these 20 kids. Pauline's and my hidden agenda, if I can use that as the term, was that eventually those kids will be so excited with what they saw, with some of the ideas. We were going to steal any idea we could from Osrui and Frenchify it because there's certain things that just couldn't work in France. But we wanted to take as much as we could. And and in France, a counselor has to have a license. They have a state license for counselors, and you have to go through these programs and so forth. And we knew that as these kids got older, that we could convince them to get that. It's called a BAFA. They get this license, and when we have enough of them, we could open up our own camp. That's exactly what we did. We're now this summer we're going to open up our 7th year. We had 160 kids at our last camp. So it's the French Osrui. I mean, we have no problem whatsoever saying all of our inspiration came from this camp here. There's nothing like though in France, because the French style of the fact that Judaism, liberal Judaism, is integrated everywhere throughout. So you have prayers, you have the limud, the studies, you have so it's just living Judaism 24 hours a day, which is all the other Jewish camps, Orthodox even. The only thing that's Orthodox is they have kosher food. That's it, and they might have Shabbat. But so that's something that we've created since then, and slowly spinning off. The other thing that we realized is we have, like I said, we have 18 synagogues now in France that are non-Orthodox. Wow. French synagogues developed because there is somebody in charge. They like to have a Napoleon. This is not a grassroots society. Even since the government takes care of so many social themes, it's just assumed somebody takes care of this and it's going to filter down. It's just part of the culture. I'd like to say I'm in the last communist country of Europe, but anyway, that's my but knowing that, we don't have rabbis to develop, and if you don't have rabbis, your community will limp along. It will never develop. That's just the bottom line. So as of last year, we created a rabbinical school. That's also on my, I should put on my, so we have 7 students right now in our rabbinical school. We've been working with all of the international bodies, the CCAR, Jerusalem, all of the heads of the rabbinical schools, to make sure that when they come out of our school, they will not be considered a second level rabbi, but they will be accepted at the same levels as HUC or JTS or some other schools. I have the privilege of being the instructor in first year Talmud and codes with with our students. But to give you an idea of where we're going, the Orthodox rabbinical school that I said they tried to kill off, they have maybe 11 students right now in their rabbinical school. For the largest Jewish community outside of the United States and Israel, 11 rabbis, future rabbis, means that they do not have enough to even replace the rabbis who are going to retire in the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of the Jewish communities outside of Paris are already liberal. Without, they may be attached to the consistoire, but because of interfaith marriages, because you live far away from the synagogue, you have to take a car if you want to drive and so forth. They're told the message, it's better to stay at home than to take the car and come to the synagogue. Those communities outside of Paris are slowly dying off. If we can present a reasonable person who has studied through French literature and culture has the degrees within French universities before they even can start our rabbinical school. They will then and then go through our study programs. They have a fighting chance to be hired by these communities, and we can flip them. So right now, we already see one or two of those communities that are in negotiations with some of our students, even at this point. So the future right now is becoming very exciting for non-Orthodox liberal Judaism having a growth here in France, starting from the kids all the way through the rabbinical students.
It's very exciting. I know it's at the end of your day. I have one question from Lee Rivlin. Lee, go ahead.
Go.
Hi.
Hi.
Good morning.
I'm sorry I talked so much, but
No, it was fantastic. You're getting a lot of good reviews in the chat.
okay. I don't read chats, but okay.
Jeff and I were on the Lakeside Synagogue trip to Morocco several years ago.
Yeah.
And we planned a week-long layover in Paris on our way home from the trip. And it coincided with Passover. So Rabbi Ike suggested that we contact you and Kehilat Gesher to participate in the community Seder.
Did I help? I don't know. Sometimes the things can. Did I
yes,
do okay? Okay.
So we were there, and it was just wonderful. It's a community Seder, hundreds of people. It's part Seder, part spiel with songs and skits, and the children come on stage. And we were seated at a table with some wonderful expats, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I was just hoping you could share with everybody how this community tradition came to be.
Right, and we wanted to thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to hear that I actually followed through on something, so that's good. But what can I say? In France, we thought it was very important to give people tools to make sure that they have their first Seder in their homes with their families and friends. French families has still a real meaning here that I can remember when I was a kid in America. I'm not so sure it's the same today, but for example, Talmud Torah, you have to be done by 12:30 on Sunday because kids go from here to the grandparents for that family once a week dinner at the grandparents. That's still part of that tradition. Okay, so and so we knew the first night had to be like that. And from a liberal Jewish viewpoint, the first night is the Seder, right? Especially if we're following the Bible says there's only 7 days of Passover. The second day is for historical reasons. Some will say it's your punishment because you're outside of Israel, but I don't know. Whatever it is. So the result is we don't think the second night is at all obligatory. And so we decided that's the night to have the fun community Seder where people, okay, you've been with your families, let's come to your second family, the community family, and let's let our hair down, let's do crazy stuff, whatever ideas come up, have the kids involved, have skits, have seen the crazy songs and so forth. And it's because of that also, as you saw, about 300 people probably come to that Seder, 300 to 400 people every year. It's except for this last year, obviously.
And it was multilingual as well.
Yes. Yeah, I had to put together everything I have in my synagogue is trilingual, with Hebrew, French, and English. I also, my latest Siddur that I just had published, I also have a transliteration. For those who don't read Hebrew just yet, I was very mixed about it because I know that there's the literate who know how to read Hebrew, there's the illiterate who don't know how to read Hebrew, and now I've created the transliterate. But that's my hope is that nonetheless that one day they will want to turn over and go to the Hebrew because it's so much easier to me. I don't understand how to read the transliteration that I created. But we had that for the Haggadah, and when I did that Haggadah that you used, it was so long ago that they didn't have the programs like Vanessa will know this one, Dafka Writer, that was not available. So I had to type up the Hebrew, cut it out, and then paste it on a paper. And then I had to type up the French and the English, cut it out, put it on a paper, and then take photocopies from that, which became the Haggadah. And all these years later, we're still using that one. probably in the next couple of weeks, we're doing a massive work to try and come up with one that has to be online, because we're all in the same situation as you. Last year was our Passover was our first event that we had online. We had about 400 connections for that community Seder online, but it didn't work quite as well as the in-person ones that you saw, because I don't even have fiber in my home. So we did it from our home. It didn't hold up so well, but we got through it. This year we have to be better about it.
I'm sure it'll be great. I have two comments, and then I know we have to let you go, Susan, and then Bob Benton. Susan Wellach, do you want to unmute?
Yes, Rabbi, thank you for a very interesting presentation, but I do have a comment. We have a very dear friend who, an American young woman who emigrated to Paris about 25 years ago, and she became a French citizen, a young Jewish woman, and she has said she never really has felt any anti-Semitism there. She lives in the 17th arrondissement, and she said she actually gets more trouble for being an American than for being Jewish. I'd like you to comment on that.
Because it makes me think about the fact that my kids rightly point out that I've been here all these years and I never really learned to speak French correctly. I have a very thick accent, American accent in French. You may think I have an accent in English. But the reality is for the French, I have a very American accent. But what I discovered is that just as in America, if you want to sell something, you give it a French touch. Look at all of the great products that we have. If there's something French in it, that's what they use to make it a chic to sell. In France, it's exactly the opposite. If you have a little bit of something American in it, it helps sells the product. Because in fact, the two cultures love and hate each other. They both countries think that it's our role to bring democracy to the world. Both countries think that we're here to bring culture to the world. Both countries think our language should be the language everyone speaks, right? Both countries are terrible about learning another language. Out of all the countries of Europe, France is the worst country to try. They have a problem trying to learn another language because everyone should speak French. And America, like we don't even really make a real try to make that everyone have a second language. But all the other countries around Europe, they all have. Even the British are not so bad about learning another language. So there's something inherent that we can see in each other's culture what we can't see in ourselves. So we're willing to tackle them, but they don't see it in ourselves. And so I think that there's that aspect going on, the love-hate American relationship. My luck, though, as a rabbi, young rabbi, when I first came here, since I didn't speak French, at that first place I was hired for, they said, well, this is a guy who has a lot of knowledge, but he can't really communicate with the others. So what they did is they found somebody my age who was bilingual, and they gave me all the teenagers. And they figured, okay, the teenagers are learning English. We'll have a bilingual guy with them, and he'll work with that. They loved it. They had a rabbi to themselves, and he was American. It was like, and they taught me a lot of French, but not always the greatest French. I can still remember my wife who comes from a bourgeoisie part of French society. Because she was very famous when I first got here, we would be seated at literally a Rothschild family dinner or something of that sort. And in French culture, when you're first married, you have to sit apart from your spouse. For the first year, you can sit together. After that, you always must be placed apart. That's just how it goes. We were apart, but she was at an angle across from me. And the idea is so that way people can talk on their own and not dependent upon their spouse and create your own conversations. And people started asking me questions, and I started answering, but I didn't realize when you don't have a sense of language yet, you don't have the sense of levels of language. And so I was basically talking like I was a ghetto French, to people who are, like, well, shit, man, like something of that sort, at a very fancy type thing, and I'd get these little kicks under the table for my wife who's trying to reach under you, so I shut up. So, but people loved it. They loved the accent. Whereas I discovered British accents in French feels like they're grating their nerves. So it's interesting how, again, what we think sounds nice or not. I was lucky. I lucked out on that.
Well, when I've been to France, I always try to speak French. And then the people I'm speaking to give up so on my French that they start speaking English to me.
It's like Israelis in that sense.
I was just going to say that. Okay, Bob, one last question.
Yeah, very quickly. I'm a member of a choir that went to France, and we sang at Copernic. We were invited by the female cantor, the only one in Europe, we were told. Her husband is the assistant rabbi.
Right.
And she selected the music, and one of the things we sang was Kol Nidre. And I wondered why we were singing Kol Nidre to a cantor. And it turned out, at least the backstory was told to us, that as the assistant rabbi and a female, she wasn't allowed to do the high holidays. So by having us sing it with her at a concert, that's how she learned it. Interesting.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but you're right. She's married to the rabbi. There's two rabbis. Actually, they don't say which one is the main rabbi, because whenever a synagogue does that, it literally means the president wants to be the chief rabbi, the main rabbi, because he said, oh no, we don't have a senior rabbi, we don't have an assistant, we have two rabbis. Okay, that's my regard on that. But she's the wife of one of the two, and they won't hire her because she's a woman. So she's the only trained cantor, female cantor in France, and she doesn't have an official job anywhere. So she was using you guys to be able to get to sneak that in. So it was very worthwhile. I did the same thing at this very synagogue. The very first time we had the World Union for Progressive Judaism had in the last 20 years, they had an event in Paris. The main rabbi at the time period of that place didn't want to be involved in this at all. He took off to Thailand and they basically said, whatever you guys do, World Union, it's not on my watch, I'm away. And so people naturally turned to me and said, okay, you're in charge of this service. And so for Shabbat morning, I was the first person to ever call up a woman to the Torah. And the thing I did, though, is I called up the oldest woman on the council of that synagogue, figuring, okay, she has the status, and then the yichus, exactly. And then I had all of the rest of the council stand behind her, but I had her say the blessing and so forth. And that was, I don't know how many years ago, about 16, 17 years ago. It was only 2 years ago, 15 years later, that you had the Copernican Revolution, and women are now allowed to be called up to the Torah in that synagogue, but they cannot wear a talit nor kippah.
All right, Marcia, quick question. Go ahead.
OK. Bonjour, je vous remercie de votre présentation. Mais vous parlez du 17e arrondissement, mais je croyais que la plupart des Juifs parisiens habitent au 3e et 4e arrondissement où se trouve la rue des Rosiers.
So first off, your French is very good. Thank you. She's saying that she thought that the Jewish quarter is in the 3rd and 4th, in particular the place called Le Marais, and the street, the epic streak is Rue des Rosiers. I actually live on Rue des Rosiers, so for my entire time that I live in France, I can tell you I live in the 4th.
Le restaurant, L'As du Falafel.
Yes.
Magnifique.
Yeah, it's the best falafel outside of Israel is easily at L'As du Falafel, hands down, and even for many of the restaurants in Israel, I can say. But that being said, that's the historical Jewish neighborhood. But today, maybe 5% maximum is Jewish. My kids, when they went to school, in their classes, there was only 1 or 2 other Jews in their class. But the school that's closest by, it has a terrible history from World War II, because 280 kids were rounded up from that school who were all Jewish, who were sent to the camps, and only a few came back. And so that school every year does a program where they sing a song in Yiddish, they sing a song in Hebrew, and then they read the names of all of the kids who were murdered. And the mayor also does something. My kids, I have 4 kids who are now, they're older. The oldest is mid-20s, and the youngest just came out of high school. But they all have the role in school to teach all of the other kids who are Muslim or black, or the France of today, how to pronounce the chetz and all of the Hebrew sounds of the song, so they can pronounce it. But it's always moving to see the people who represent France today singing a Yiddish song, and so forth. I mean, but it's the historical area. But as soon as people got out, it's sort of the Marais. I could use the example for those who knew New York. I don't know Chicago so well, but it's like the Lower East Side. This is where everyone came in, and as soon as you could get the hell out, you got the hell out. And if you did well, you went up to the Upper East Side, and if you did really well, you went out to Westchester County. Well, we have the same thing. As soon as you could get out of that dump, literally the Marais was called in the 60s the armpit of Paris. Today, everyone wants to live there. It is the hottest area to live.
It's very hot, definitely.
It's very expensive, etc.
Right. All right, we have one more question. Marvin, go ahead.
Oh, wait, I got to unmute. Oh, yes, I'm unmuted. When we were in Paris, we found it very difficult to ask people about the memorial deportation. Nobody would tell us where it was. And every time we got there, it was closed. So we found that very frustrating. It was right near
It's right by my neighborhood. It's in my neighborhood.
Notre Dame.
Yeah, right in back of Notre Dame.
No, that's not the Jewish memorial for the deportation at Notre Dame. The Jewish one is right by the Metro Saint Paul in the Marais. We have 2. The one that you're thinking of right behind Notre Dame is the French government's memorial to the deportation. It's run by the military, so any French holiday, it's closed. The hours are, they have governmental hours. It's difficult to get to. I think, though, it's incredible because it's the first memorial in Europe for the deportation, and it was done by the French government. And they didn't do it in a place like the Roundup Centers, which was just north of Paris. There was a camp called Drancy, and it was the staging camp where all the Jews were sent to Auschwitz. They should have, by historical reasons, put it at Drancy. But if they had put it at Drancy, nobody would go there because nobody knows where the hell is Drancy. So they put it on the most expensive real estate of entire France, right behind Notre Dame. They built a memorial. It's not so, it has lots of problems, but because it's for the deportation of all people, Jews who are the majority, but also communists, gays, and all those sorts of things. But it's there. But the Jewish community said it's necessary but not sufficient, and they built another one that's nearby. That's why there might be a confusion of which memorial did the deportation.
Right.
And
we ended up at a memorial that was a smaller version of Yad Vashem.
Well, that would have been the memorial for the deportation, which is the Jewish one, which has changed greatly in the past period of time because of an American Jew, if I can use that as an example.
Yeah.
Do I have the time to say
They were most gracious. It was the end of the day, and they opened it up for us so we could make a donation.
Yeah, and that place, the place when the Americans were putting pressure on the Swiss to reveal monies that were deposited in accounts or insurance companies that Jews never came back to get those monies and so forth. Because of that, the French government started looking around. Are there properties in France that never went back to Jews? They discovered one particular building that's nearby, that a gorgeous building that was being rebuilt as a courthouse. And the French government realized it belonged to one Jewish family, this gorgeous, huge complex, who the entire generations were all killed in the war. And so they gave the Jewish community the money, the worth of that building, to be used at the memorial of the deportation, the Jewish one, where they rebuilt it into a center for learning of tolerance. On the side of that building that you were at, the street, they have now the names of every righteous French person who was confirmed by a Jew and by Yad Vashem as the righteous of the nation. They have all the law, and they try and teach people who would stand up to the government. Most of my bar and bat mitzvahs, one of the moving moments is a lot of my Ashkenazi families, they invite the family that saved their parents or grandparents. And so you have somewhere in Toulouse, grandkids of the person who had saved the grandpa on this side come up, and because they still maintain relationships, they come, and after their ceremony, after the service, and after everyone's eaten, because we're Jewish, you have to eat, then they go to the memorial and they take a picture with them pointing to the name of the person, of that family member who saved the Jew, of the descendants of that. And that's part of the traditions of the bar mitzvahs.
Wow. Beautiful.
Yeah,
So
it
so
is
it's great.
fantastic.
Right.
I know
Does it say
you have to go,
Yeah.
and as soon as COVID is over, maybe Macomb Solar Lakeside can come visit you at Kehilat Gesher.
Not only that, I do walking tours of Jewish Paris, past and present. I'll show you where the Talmuds were burned, where Rashi and all those guys go.
Perfect. And thank you. Have that person call me about Limudim, or you know how to get a hold of me.
Yes,
And
yes.
we do have a quick, of course, we have to have some announcements.
God, go for it.
Right. Diane, go ahead. You need to unmute. There you go.
Okay, on March 5th, please join the Tikkun Olam Committee for the first of a three-part series, Building a Just Society, defining the work we want to do and working toward making it happen. Our keynote speaker will be Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is the Executive Director of Chua. It'll be a fascinating evening. We ask you to invite people from other congregations to join us. Send out the flyer to as many friends as you have, and be there on March 15th. And we'll tell you more information about the next two sessions after that.
It's March 15th. It's next Monday, 15th.
Monday, 1/5.
Right,
Seven.
1/5, right.
Thank you.
And this afternoon, we have a fireside chat about commitment to the community. So log on to that. And if you need any links, you know where to get a hold of me. And I cannot thank Rabbi Tom enough.
I can't thank you enough, because she took us under her wings and she helped us. And I have to tell you, when we were at the camp over the years, it was not always easy, the cultural conflicts that happened. And then most of it, we couldn't even foresee until we were there and understand what was going on. And people were reading things different. And not everyone was easy about understanding that there can be cultural conflicts. You're a rabbi, you're an educator there. I mean, Vanessa was wonderful, because she helped all of everybody get through this. She saw that sometimes that some people weren't acting out; they were just understanding things through their bubble and trying to get everyone to understand each other's point of view. We didn't, without somebody like her, we would have had a much harder time, and we might not have come away with the ideas that we did to create our camp.
Oh, thank you so much.
No, but it's
All
true.
right.
So
great to
as soon as
see
she asked,
everyone.
I said yes.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci
And
beaucoup.
we'll see you this week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom. Oh, Shabbat tov. Sorry.
Shavua tov,
Right.
whatever day it is.
Right,
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
It was wonderful. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. À bientôt à Paris.
À bientôt.
À bientôt.